I absolutely love Transformers. Just in case that wasn't obvious enough. I distinctly remember getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning when I was 8 years old to watch reruns of Transformers Cybertron, or bringing my fast-action battlers Fusion Blast Megatron everywhere my mom took me because I thought it was just the coolest thing ever. Hell, I still think it's the coolest thing ever. I mean, look at this little shit. Masterpiece Megatron? Get the fuck out of... Oh. But besides the great cartoons and the badass toys, one of the coolest things to me is that it's one of those series from your childhood that I think actually gets better the older you get. I mean, as a kid, I was mostly just interested in the awesome concept of giant alien robots that can turn into vehicles and back, bringing their war to Earth. But as an adult, well, of course, I still think that idea is awesome, but I also now hold a deeper appreciation for some of the absolutely phenomenal stories, characters, and voice performances we've gotten over the past few decades. And speaking of those past few decades, something else that I think is neat about Transformers is the fact that there's no one recommended place to start, and every new series or continuity will be somebody's first and ultimately give rise to new fans. There are those who have been with the series since the days of Generation 1, and those who've only recently hopped on board during the run of Transformers Cyberverse. In my case, like a lot of other people my age really, I was ultimately introduced to Transformers in 2007 with the release of the first live-action movie directed by Michael Bay. I distinctly remember seeing tie-in Lunchables and Burger King commercials for it on TV all the time. I actually got a Starscream toy from one of those Lunchables, which led to him becoming a personal favorite character of mine almost instantly. And that Burger King commercial was the last thing I saw on TV before going to the theater with my mom to actually see the movie, which I was super excited about. It was the first PG-13 movie I'd ever seen in theaters, which was a big deal for an 8-year-old like me at the time. And in the end, it would go on to really ignite my love for giant robots that was initially sparked several years prior by the Iron Giant. Needless to say, I loved every second of the movie, and with Transformers Animated airing very shortly after and grabbing my attention as well, I was obsessed with Transformers for many years before growing out of it shortly after the release of the third entry in the Bayverse, before growing back into it very recently. Looking back though, I've realized that while Revenge of the Fallen and Dark of the Moon definitely aren't as amazing as I remembered them being, the first movie still holds up incredibly well, and it seems like I'm not the only one who thinks that. If you take a look anywhere online, while the rest of the live-action movies, not including Bumblebee for obvious reasons, are widely panned by seemingly everyone for a variety of different reasons, the first one is the only one that most general audiences, critics, and Transformers fans seem to actually like, or are at least okay with, and I think I actually understand why. After rewatching it and all the other movies in the series more times than I can keep track of and would care to admit if I did, I've actually observed a ton of work and detail in the first movie that really helped to make it work as a Transformers movie and really a movie in general, in many ways that the other ones just don't, at least to the same extent. So, what made Transformers '07 so awesome? Isn't that cool? I said the title. First and foremost, let's talk about the main attractions themselves, the Transformers. There are a total of 12 of them in the first movie, 5 Autobots and 7 Decepticons, though if you remove Scorponok and Frenzy from the mix since they exclusively act as threats for the human characters anyway, that leaves us with 5 on each side. A much smaller cast compared to the other entries to be sure, but I think that it works to the first's advantage. For one, because they can't rely on an endless stream of generics like protoforms or KSI drones to sacrifice as cannon fodder for the sake of the Mighty Mike's explosion obsession, they make up for it by making the Cybertronians here very durable, taking hit after hit after hit before they finally go down. Better yet is the fact that none of them, whether it be Bumblebee after losing the use of his legs or Brawl when he's being fired at by everybody on all sides, they don't go down without a fight, which not only makes the action more exciting, but more brutal, like actual lives are being lost here. Don't get me wrong, I don't really have a problem with generics in Transformers, but not only do some of the best Transformers media also refrain from using them for one reason or another, but compared to a cartoon, it just doesn't work in a live-action movie, especially one with a very heavy focus on military know-how and such, when everything, even the characters with actual names and personalities go down in a hit or two, and often in the dumbest, most anticlimactic ways possible. Seriously, how the fuck did Sam manage to kill Laserbeak? Speaking of personalities, let's talk about those of our main bots, because a good personality is one of the biggest keys to a good character. Well, it's really up to a matter of personal taste as to whether they were done justice here or not, but I myself like them quite a bit. And I can definitely say that I'm very happy that they're all distinct and likable, unlike in the other movies where every Autobot is either an obnoxious smartass or a murderous psychopath. You have the sleek and stylish cool guy Jazz, the collected and thorough brains of the group Ratchet, the gruff old-timey soldier Ironhide, the eager little brother looking to prove himself Bumblebee. And actually, let's talk about Optimus a bit later. There's a lot more I want to say about him. What I really appreciate, though, is the fact that their characterization isn't relegated to one-liners and pop culture references that they spew sometimes, and it seems like the filmmakers remember that sometimes action does speak louder than words, because most of the time their personalities are expressed through their body language and voice acting. Using Jazz as an example, they absolutely nailed the cool guy thing with him by making him the most acrobatic of the group as he's constantly flipping, jumping, and sliding all over the place like he's doing parkour, which also makes him the perfect fit for this nice reference to Cup in the '87 movie, and Darius McCary, like Scatman Crothers before him, was the perfect choice for such a slick, laid-back character. Or look at Frenzy, with the way he cracks his knuckles before hacking a mainframe and smashing his head against the computer when it doesn't work. It establishes him as this cocky little shit with a short temper without even having him speak a lick of anything human, with little Cybertroning or other mouthy gibberish he spouts only furthering that as he complains about getting shot at, as if he didn't think that would have happened if anybody saw him. I'll admit that the character work isn't top tier by any means, especially with the Decepticons who, outside of Frenzy, don't really have that much character to speak of outside of we're the evil bad guys, but it's completely serviceable for a movie like this, and I would say that they clearly put more effort into the personalities of these characters than most other popcorn movie directors probably would have. And on the plus side, even if most of the individual Decepticons don't stand out that much, they very much make up for that with their very, very menacing presence, and a key to that is the designs. Again, it's up to a matter of taste, but I personally like the designs in this movie a lot. Sure, most of them don't really resemble their G1 counterparts in any capacity, but I think that's totally fine, especially when considered that this movie came out before Hasbro started using the G1 designs as the basis for any new iterations of the characters going forward. I mean, yeah, the Bayverse Ironhide doesn't look anything like G1 Ironhide, but to be fair, the last Ironhide before the Bayverse looked like this, and the last Ironhide before that looked like this. Even if they look radically different compared to what we're used to, they still look great on their own and avoid all of the major issues that I personally have with other designs in the series, whether that be wonky proportions, overly humanoid features, or just having way too many things going on. I mean, sure, Starscream, Blackout, and Bone Crusher do have some odd proportions, but they don't necessarily feel totally awkward or unnatural for an alien robot of all things to have. Really, that's just one factor in the greatest strength of these designs, that being the separation between the two factions based on their appearances. The Autobots are rounder and more in proportion with humans, with brighter colorizations and truck and car alternate modes, while the Decepticons have sharper, more exaggerated insect-like features, are dull and muted in color and turn into a variety of military vehicles, all with the exception of Megatron's Cybertronian jet mode, which still looks very outfitted for battle. If you line up all of these characters and try to discern who's who solely based on their appearance, you could very easily pick out who's an Autobot and who's a Decepticon without issue, which I think is awesome. And really, they could have just left it there and it would have been totally fine. But no, they go above and beyond here and further differentiate the two warring factions from each other by utilizing many other aspects of the film, like the sound design or the editing. First off, not only is Steve Jablonsky's score absolutely fantastic as is, but it's even better within the context of the actual movie because it's perfectly utilized all throughout. The ominous booming and wailing of the music that plays during the raid on guitar, all coupled with the fact that Blackout himself is constantly filmed from a downward angle, shrouded in shadow, only visible by his beady red eyes, It makes him out to be this big hulking monster or demon who's come to destroy us all, completely juxtaposed to the arrival of the Autobots on Earth, with the soothing choir and the building trumpets, not to mention the Autobots being constantly bathed in light and on eye level with the camera. It makes them seem more wondrous and grand, almost like guardian deities that have come to save us. I'm probably looking into it a little too deep with that whole angel-demon analogy, but I think you get my point. I mean, even the way they speak is very noticeably different, as the Decepticons have a much more gurgled and roboticized tone of voice to them, constantly going on about their desire to claim the Allspark and conquer the Earth, while the Autobots are much more courageous and gentle as they go on about their desire to prevent that from actually happening.
We cannot let the humans pay for our mistakes. It's been an honor serving with you all.
I live to serve you, Lord Megatron.
Where is the cube?
The humans have taken it.
So does this movie have the best cast of characters in all of film history? Definitely not. Does it have the best iterations of these characters in the entire Transformers franchise? No. However, even if the majority of these characters don't have the screen time or dialogue to properly flesh out their personalities, I still hold a great deal of appreciation for how they were able to show you who are the good guys and who are the bad guys without needlessly beating you over the head with it with obnoxious, on-the-nose dialogue and such, and how they utilize everything from the music, editing, and shot composition to express that the Autobots are true heroes fighting because they know what's right, and to make the Decepticons just plain shit-your-pants terrifying. But there is one specific character who acts as an exception to this rule, and I'm pretty sure you already know who it is.
My name is Optimus Prime. We are autonomous robotic organisms from the planet Cybertron.
So, as much as I'm able to enjoy most of the Bayverse despite its many flaws, the one thing I've never been able to get used to is the characterization of Optimus Prime. I don't know, I just don't think the Hollywood tough guy thing they go for works for a character like him, who's supposed to believe that freedom is the right of all sentient beings, and that isn't helped by how he will literally taunt his enemies as he rips their faces off or executes them with a point-blank gunshot when they're groveling and begging for mercy.
We're giving you freedom! You defend my family. Or die.
But I've only realized very recently that that only applies to him from Revenge of the Fallen onward, because he really isn't like that at all in the first movie. The Optimus of this movie is actually depicted as a fairly kind-hearted and gentle individual, at least as much as a soldier like him could possibly be during such a horrible war. And he definitely seems to care much more for the lives of his allies than his own, as he spends most of his screen time actually protecting them rather than fighting. For example, Optimus is adamant all throughout the film on destroying the Allspark to the point where he would sacrifice himself and potentially Megatron in the process in order to do it. However, when the time comes and Sam uses the Allspark in order to destroy Megatron instead, even with the knowledge that it could kill both of them in the process anyway, Optimus is still insistent that Sam push the cube into his chest instead.
Sam, put the cube in my chest now! Sam! No, Sam!
Self-sacrifice as is a great way to gain sympathy from the audience when it's done right, and I definitely think it is here. Optimus is a character who wants to avoid as much needless death as possible, to the point where he would sacrifice himself over his arch nemesis in order to end the war. And the fact that he does that even with the knowledge that he could just push the cube into Megatron's spark instead and potentially survive, I think is genuinely heroic. And I think that's made even more so if you consider the idea that Optimus was most likely worried and afraid that Sam could potentially die while approaching Megatron, and would rather give his own life in order to prevent that from happening. Despite all of that though, there's really nothing wrong necessarily with Optimus killing on the battlefield because he's never been averted to it necessarily. He's not Batman after all. It's really just a matter of how it's handled. Let's compare him killing Bone Crusher, his one and only kill in the first movie, to him killing Demolisher, Grindor, The Fallen, Shockwave, Megatron, Sentinel Prime, or for that matter just any of his kills in the other movies. Bone Crusher's death is brutal for sure, but not unnecessarily cruel to the point of it just being uncomfortable. Bone Crusher himself is shown to be very able-bodied and dangerous rather than basically being crippled to the point of not even being a threat, and most importantly to me at least, Optimus doesn't talk and behave in ways that make him sound like a cold-blooded murderer. I mean, how much worse would it have been if he talked like this?
You
See how much less heroic that would have been compared to his silence in the actual movie, which makes it seem like he really doesn't want to be doing this? Optimus doesn't scream or shout war cries as he lunges into battle, he doesn't treat every Decepticon death as some kind of victory, and he doesn't stand heroically at the battle's end. He remains incredibly solemn during the final act because he understands that lives have been lost on both sides. He mourns one of his greatest comrades as well as his arch nemesis, and rather than his trademark closing narration being some kind of uplifting victory speech, or a fucking another declaration of war, he laments over the loss of his homeworld as he hopes to reach whatever Autobots are still out there and need refuge. Optimus Prime isn't just a robot. He's a living being who shows remorse for those who die on the battlefield, whether they be an ally or an enemy, and as such, he doesn't treat the battle in Mission City as any kind of victory or accomplishment, because the end of such a war with that many lives lost is not a cause for celebration. But all of that's not to say that Optimus is all soldier all the time, because there's actually quite a bit of lightheartedness behind him and he displays some moments of humor. Like when he accidentally steps on the fountain and is just like, oops, sorry about that. Or when he's almost spotted by Sam's dad and just lets out the most genuine sounding whoa I've ever heard. He even has some father-like qualities like he did in G1, whether he's tired and grumpy waiting for Sam to just find those damn glasses already, or when he catches Sam in the Allspark and says, I got you boy, which sounds exactly like something my dad would have said after picking me up when I was 5 and taking me on a snowmobile ride, and that makes me smile every time. And of course, it's needless to say that Peter Cullen in the role again for the first time in 20 years more or less is a godsend. He sounds amazing as always, and he truly brings the character to life better than anyone else. And I will always appreciate the fact that his reprisal here made his way for return in plenty of other movies, shows, and video games afterwards. Of course, it would have been even better if we actually got Frank Welker back too, but hey, you can't always win. At least we have Transformers Prime for that. Now, I know what you're probably thinking by this point. Mr. Sentinel Prime's chin, can I call you Dennis? You've been talking about nothing but the robots this entire video and how cool they are. But what about the human characters of the story? Those are important too. Well, first of all, no, you cannot call me Dennis. In fact, I don't even know where you got that name from. And second, you are absolutely right. The human characters in the story are indeed important. So why don't we go over those now? I will begin though by saying the same thing I say about Godzilla. Human characters matter. I know that it's fun to meme on human characters and Transformers from time to time for various reasons, and it goes without saying that some of them are indeed not great, but I don't think it's fair to act as if they're all bad or nobody cares about them, as I think that attitude is kind of unfair to characters like Sari Sumdak and Agent Fowler, who are not only great characters, but are among the best parts of their respective series. Plus, as I briefly touched on much earlier, I find the idea of these aliens fighting their war on the more or less unrelated Earth as a really cool idea, and especially in the case of the Bayverse, as the presence of humans not only emphasizes the horror of war, especially from an outsider perspective, but the sheer size and power of these robots. Okay, Dennis, that's cool and all, but can you actually get to specifically talking about the characters from this movie already? I told you not to call me that, but sure. Yeah, they're good. I'd give them a solid B-.
A B-?
Well, yeah, they're not going to win any Best Human Characters in Transformers awards anytime soon, but I still think they work all things considered. In general, I feel that the humans mostly act as the main source of comedy throughout the movie, which I'm honestly okay with because the humor is actually pretty good, as it's based mostly around amusing banter and interactions between the characters and, for the most part, doesn't resort to the overly juvenile jokes about drugs, sex, bodily waste, or stereotypes from the other movies. I said for the most part, goddammit. putting my own terrible jokes aside, another reason why I think the comedy actually works so well in the first movie is because the chemistry between the actors and their individual performances are great, and everybody brings so much life to their role. Seriously, everything that Glenn says is absolute comedy gold. If not for the jokes themselves, then for Anthony Anderson's delivery, because he nails it every time.
No, this is my private area, my place of zen and peace.
Listen to me.
And of course, it's not just him. Tyrese Gibson and John Turturro are amazing as well. Bernie Mac is one of the film's highlights even with his limited screen time, and Shia LaBeouf really does not get the credit he deserves for his role as Sam, because he does make for a fun and interesting protagonist. I think people just kind of give him shit for screaming at times, as if it's unreasonable for a 16 or 17-year-old to do so when going through such traumatic events. He's kind of like Shinji in that sense, just with less depression. But the humans aren't just solely there for comedy or to help emphasize the sheer size of the robots, because there are two congruent human stories occurring over the course of the movie, one focusing on Sam and the other on Captain Linux, and they ultimately converge in the final act with the main focus on the Autobots and the Decepticons. And something I only realized very recently is that these two characters and the challenges they face along their journey seems to directly reflect the Autobots and their struggle. Lennox continues to fight against such impossible odds with the hope of eventually returning home in order to see his wife and daughter again, which could be directly compared to the Autobots searching and fighting for the Allspark and hoping that they can return home. And while Lennox makes it home safely and returns to his family, the Allspark is destroyed, and with it, the Autobots' chance of bringing life back to Cybertron. Meanwhile, Sam, this regular kid whose main concern just a few days prior was getting a car and spending time with the girl he likes, suddenly has the fate of all of humanity in his hands, and he works and fights alongside the Autobots to find the Allspark and keep it out of the hands of the Decepticons. However, they ultimately realize that they may have no choice but to destroy it to keep it out of Megatron's grasp. And while Optimus decides to sacrifice himself to do so for the sake of his comrades and humanity, Sam risks his own life instead to protect his friend from certain death and destroy Megatron. We see from both the human and Cybertronian perspectives that war is not as simple as the good guys win and everyone is happy, because sometimes those good guys will make mistakes or be forced to do something they don't want to, and there is a loss on both sides of the battlefield, as one person may get to go home while the other can't. And we can see that even if they are torn apart by war and death, there is goodness within that pervades and proves that they're not just heartless killing machines. Because even if many of them are scared, confused, and don't know what to do, there are those who are outspoken against such horrors and will fight for what's right. I think this brief interaction between Ironhide and Optimus perfectly sums up what I'm trying to say.
Why are we fighting to save the humans? They're a primitive and violent race. Were we so different?
And with that, I've pretty much gone over all of my main points, so let's just take these last few minutes to go over some miscellaneous details I want to talk about in no particular order because writing scripts is hard. The special effects? Holy shit, they look incredible. And I honestly find it so hard to believe that this movie actually came out 14 years ago because they still hold up. And it's not just the CGI, because there's actually an extensive use of practical effects all throughout the movie, and they look absolutely phenomenal as well. I remember owning a copy of Transformers: The Ultimate Guide when I was a kid, and on one page they showed that they actually made a full-scale model of Bumblebee for certain scenes, and my 8-year-old self was blown away because I thought that was so cool. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and that single page is probably the catalyst that led to my love of practical effects today. Honestly though, they really didn't need to go through all of that effort considering the complexity of the robot designs, or none of the other movies really utilizing practical effects other than some basic props for the human characters. But the fact that they did it anyway is something I deeply appreciate. And of course, how could I forget the incredible influence that this movie had on the Transformers series going forward, for better or for worse depending on who you ask. It was this movie that introduced the Allspark and the idea that Optimus Prime and Megatron were friends before the war, two separate concepts that have gone on to be featured in virtually every major Transformers continuity afterwards. It was this movie that saw the return of Bumblebee, a character who hadn't appeared in several years due to Hasbro not being able to secure a trademark on his name, and nowadays it's impossible to see a new Transformers series without him. And it was this movie that would ultimately unify the Transformers with previous and/or subsequent versions of themselves, instead of just using their names haphazardly for whoever to keep the trademark. Whether that be Ironhide finally returning to his role as the gruff old-timer with a ton of guns and one of Optimus's right-hand men, or finally giving the names Blackout and Barricade to a definitive character, as we would see later with Bulkhead in Transformers Animated and Knockout in Transformers Prime. But really, I think the answer to the question of what made this movie so awesome comes down to a single scene, my personal favorite scene in the movie. During the battle between Optimus and Bone Crusher, we briefly see it from the perspective of a woman in her car. She slams on the brakes, we get this slow-mo close-up shot of Bone Crusher being punched in the face, and this is the reaction we see from her son in the passenger seat. This little moment that lasts only about a couple seconds is absolutely brilliant. The simultaneous shock and excitement this kid shows from watching these two giant robots duke it out in front of him is really no different from the way I myself reacted to watching this movie in theaters. Sure, it's a little bit scary, but it's also just so awe-inspiring. It's a scene that perfectly captures the sheer level of excitement and joy so many children and adults must have felt while watching this movie for the first time on the big screen. It was a level of spectacle that brought these 80s pop culture icons to life like we'd never seen before. It was a movie that brought old Transformers fans on a grand trip down memory lane, and captured the heart of children with its story and characters, thus creating new Transformers fans. And that, I think, is what makes Transformers 07 so awesome. Well, that marks the second time I've said the title, so I guess it's high time we start wrapping this thing up. If you somehow managed to actually get this far, thank you so much for watching, it really means a lot. And if you enjoyed this video for some reason, leave a like and give me a comment, and let me know if there's anything I missed in this video that you feel will be worth bringing up. This movie really does mean a lot to me, and I can only hope that I managed to do it some level of justice. But anyway, if you did like this video, feel free to subscribe to my channel for more content like this. And if you'd like to keep up with me outside of YouTube, feel free to follow me on Instagram and Letterboxd, links in the description. So, am I supposed to have an outro or something?
The Transformers, more than meets the eye. Autobots wage their battle to destroy the evil forces of the Decepticons. The Transformers, robots in disguise. The Transformers.